So a couple days ago, Blizzard released a huge post about the future of Diablo 4 and specifically the launch of Diablo 4 and all the different changes that they're making. However, there was one change in particular that I didn't really read too much into because, well, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. However, it seems that I have to revisit this because a couple of you left some comments as well as them completely re-updating the post with an explanation on why they did it, and we're going to go over that here. Now we're talking about the line that said they've removed the ability to reset dungeons, and this is something that I did use in the beta and any version of the game really, but this is really brought to my attention by Not Fall Hamster here, who said yesterday, Blizzard has just produced more haters than they had before by removing the option to reset dungeons. So far, it almost looks like we'll be able to do each dungeon once, unless we find someone to group with who never did the dungeons that we want to do again. So they removed the problem with bad dungeon design by removing the option to do dungeons, a lot of dungeons, again and again and again, grinding dungeons. Well, what a Blizzard move. So I think this is interesting. I also don't necessarily think that that is exactly what they were trying to do. And I don't think that that's a good representation. However, I do think that this is an interesting conversation. And I do think that Hamster here does have a point in that I don't know if this was the best thing for the game. And let's talk about that a little bit. Now, Blizzard's explanation of this was added actually after the patch notes dropped, after I did my video the other day, and so I actually didn't read this part because it wasn't there. However, Adam Fletcher here on Twitter posted, been seeing quite a bit of discussion on the reset dungeon button being disabled line. We added an extra developer note to the blog to help clarify the change. This is a pretty important one, and we're going to go through the note itself and talk about some of the implications, but I would say right off the bat, another reply to this was that kind of sucks for solo players though. I feel like if people want to spam one specific optimal dungeon, that should be allowed, or at least have a cap per hour. And Adam responded, the team is still exploring options. So one crucial thing to this is that, as far as I understand, one of the big reasons why this was done was because there are some optimal ways to farm dungeons. However, before we get into that, I'm happy to at least hear that they're exploring other options to approaching not just removing the ability to reset dungeons, because it does seem like a pretty core ARPG feature. And of course, as we've seen from a lot of the interviews and a lot of the discussion around Diablo 4, one of the key things that they mentioned was that they want it to be sort of ARPG first, Diablo first, and then MMO sort of second, or even last, in that you have some MMO features, but they're really trying to make it an ARPG. Now, let's see exactly what they've done and some of the, I guess you could say, notes associated with this. So I'll post it up here. As you can see, it just says the reset dungeon button has been disabled. This was on your emote menu. And as the developer note says, let's read through it. So while Diablo 4 Sanctuary is home to over 100 dungeons, the open beta only had the subset offered in Act 1s. I believe it was like 28, so not too many. There are many reasons to complete a variety of dungeons, including collecting powerful affixes in the Codex of Power, and players will still be able to repeat dungeons by partying up with other players and having them start the dungeon. So first off, right off the bat, that's a concerning statement to basically not have the ability to reset dungeons and forcing players to group up and having them have the ability to start dungeons for someone that hasn't done it before. I don't like that explanation, but let's continue onwards here. We also wanted to make sure that resetting the dungeon wasn't a way for hardcore players to avoid death when experiencing a challenge in a dungeon. I do think this is a reasonable consideration. Still, we know it can be fun to repeat a specific dungeon, and the team is looking at a more permanent solution to this, like having some reasonable cap on how many times the dungeon can be completed in a row. In fact, in a full game, the players will acquire sigils that will unlock nightmare dungeons, which are specifically designed to be completed repeatedly and are optimized to be highly rewarding and replayable. We'll have more to share on this in the future. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what they have to say, but I want to give a couple of my thoughts and some of my concerns associated with this. So first off, it doesn't seem like being able to repeat the dungeons is, I guess you could say, exclusive to once and then you're done for your character. It seems like you will be able to repeat dungeons because they literally say Players will acquire sigils that will unlock nightmare dungeons and are specifically designed to be completed repeatedly. So there's got to be some way to repeat dungeons. Now, they say the reset dungeon button has been disabled. Now, although they say players will be able to repeat dungeons by partying up with others and having them start the dungeon, I don't necessarily think that's exactly true, which is that when we were in the beta, as far as I remember, you were able to go out of the dungeon, go to town, and then teleport back, and that would reset the dungeon. Now, keep in mind, you have to go through the loading screen, come back with the loading screen, and then you'll be able to farm the dungeon again, which isn't necessarily nearly as sufficient as the reset dungeon button. It would lose about 20 seconds or so, but you still could do that. Another way you could do it is by logging out of the game and logging back in. That would also reset the dungeon. Both these things don't seem to have been removed from the game. They just didn't specify it. As they say here, players will still be able to repeat dungeons by partying up with others and having them start the dungeon. They don't say anything else about that, but I don't think the omission of that means that it's removed from the game as well. Again, as they mentioned in the general quality of life tab, there is no other mention of anything changing with dungeon resetting, just that the dungeon reset button has been disabled. That is a very specific targeted issue. And the thing that I believe it was targeting was the fact that you could enter a dungeon and kill off a few elites at the beginning for some dungeons and then leave the dungeon immediately after to reset it, or rather just reset it in the dungeon. What this would do is basically give you good XP, good loot, and without much of the danger, because you just have to kill a couple of elites and then you leave. You don't have to deal with any of the bosses or any of the dungeon layout mechanics, etc. Now, this was something that people enjoyed doing. And honestly, I'm usually a pretty big fan of allowing people to play the game how they want, as long as it's not breaking the core gameplay sentiment. And I don't think that this is, right? And I will talk about potentially, some people might say, well, why are you saying that when, you don't talk about open world being bad, etc. And I will address that in just a moment. But specifically, people want to repeat farm dungeons. That is a pretty core mechanic to a lot of ARPGs. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have people repeat dungeons, even if it's the most optimal strategy, right? I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Because at the end of the day, if they don't go through the campaign, as far as I've seen in the beta, which, by the way, commenter, you know who you are, it looks like you do have to complete the campaign to unlock World Tier 3, which means that they're not going to be able to access World Tier 3 if they're just sitting there repeating dungeons. At the same time, they're going to limit themselves on their renown mechanics because they have not gone and repeated a bunch of different dungeons. Though farming dungeons with just those few elites at the very beginning of the game was literally just because of the beta. So I don't really see a big issue here, and I'm not quite sure why they're so focused on this. It seems like a big problem that has arisen just from something that seems to be addressing specifically beta problems, right? A similar beta problem to this would be, some of the late game balancing that they've already done because some classes are too powerful. I don't think that they should be balancing out summoners or summon skeletons, because who knows how strong they are in the late game, which from my experience and from what I've heard, it is not amazing, okay? And so when you're just killing a couple of elites over and over and over again, you're going to inhibit your renown system, you're going to inhibit your map exploration, you're going to inhibit your campaign. And let's say you're saying, oh, well, maybe they'll do it in the end game. Well, in the end game, you're going to have nightmare sigils, which are designed to repeat dungeons. So I'm not quite sure what the issue here is, and I'm not sure why this button was removed at all. To me, their clarification just made it make less sense to me. And as I said, I believe when I went over the patch notes, I believed I said the reset dungeon button was removed. That's weird. And that's what I said. I'm not quite sure why, but it was. I think I said something along those lines, but that was my initial reaction, was that it's kind of weird. And it doesn't seem to be very important, right? I don't see a problem in terms of breaking game mechanics or even optimal strategies to reset dungeons over and over again. So coming from the perspective of Is this a good or bad thing? It just doesn't make much sense to me from Blizzard. Is it a bad thing? I would say so. I would say that this doesn't really make much sense, and overall, it's just a negative thing for the game. From what I've seen, it's not going to cause many problems, and some people may want to repeat dungeons. I don't really see the problem with that, and in fact, I repeated a ton of dungeons by resetting the dungeons over and over again, but I completed the whole dungeon. I just used that feature to reset the dungeon so I didn't have to go back to town or enter another party or log out of the game. It was just a nice feature for me, so I know I would have been affected, and a lot of other people would as well. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. I think at the end of the day, my biggest kind of point is that this just doesn't make sense. Let me know if anyone else had found an issue with it, or potentially issue in the live game that you could see justifying this. I don't really see a justification for it, and I also don't see a bad thing that Reset Dungeon has been doing. And I also, even if it was, I still think people should be able to potentially just farm one dungeon for an optimal strategy, because regardless of that, you're still going to be inhibiting your overall gameplay progression, because the game is built around you not resetting dungeons over and over and over again and farming them. Like, the game is literally built for that, and you're preventing people forcibly through game mechanics rather than just naturally pushing people towards it. And I don't like that. But again, let me know what you think in the comments section down below, and I'll be reading your comments, potentially responding to some of them as I did earlier in this video. There's another thing that I want to mention, but we might talk about tomorrow, talking about potentially skill changes that they haven't gone over, but there's going to be a live stream in the next few days that I will definitely be making a video about. Stay tuned, and I'll see you then.